User-centered design is an approach to product development that focuses specifically on the end users of a product. User research is essential for gaining an understanding of the tasks, goals, contexts of use, and skills of the user that human-centered design teams depend on. Recently, I embarked on a journey to learn more about user research by conducting a few of my own research activities. I decided to use field studies, face-to-face interviews, and an online survey, but there are many different types of activities that suit different types of research and different types of users. As technology advances, children are becoming more and more familiar with technology at earlier ages. I decided to use this opportunity to explore how children interact with technology in early learning environments by conducting my user research with kindergarten students and teachers in public schools. Before getting started, there were some important things about user research I had to learn. I learned that unlike traditional scientific methods, user research begins without a strongly formulated hypothesis. While some preconceived ideas are necessary, it's important to remain flexible so that you can follow insightful leads as they arise. I also learned that it is my responsibility as a user researcher to prioritize the safety and privacy of participants by informing them about activities and requesting consent before interviewing or recording them. Because my research involved children, I was careful to gain proper consent from their teacher and respect privacy by not recording personally identifying information. Being prepared to enter the field is extremely important. By writing detailed research ideas and designing logical protocol, I was able to decide which areas to focus on and identify the most appropriate methods for doing so. Having plans and protocol also helped me to keep the study on track once research had begun. My user research began with 3 field studies of a kindergarten classroom and a public elementary school. Field studies are useful for understanding the behavior of participants in the context of their everyday lives. I used a method of observation called deep hanging out, which uses focal points for observation and allows researchers to interact with participants when necessary. After each field study, I analyzed my field notes and coded them for the most common events and practices that I observed. Throughout the field studies, I continued to search for related practices, themes, or patterns that emerged from the data. During these field studies, I learned how strange it can feel to be an observer in a new setting. I also learned that this awkward situation can be made more comfortable for everyone involved by informing research participants of your presence and explaining a little bit about the research activities you're conducting. In any type of user research activity, it is important for the researcher to be aware of his or her own capacity to influence the outcome. By addressing his or her own preconceived notions and personal biases, the researcher can minimize the effects such feelings could have on the research subjects. The next phase of my research involved face-to-face interviews with the teacher, a student, and the principal of the school. During this activity, I learned to write clear and unambiguous questions. I also learned to keep the interview going by staying alert and engaged and asking open-ended questions that encouraged more detailed responses. While interviews are an excellent way to gather rich qualitative information about your users, it is difficult to write interview questions that do not introduce bias. I learned that researchers must take special care to avoid asking leading questions or questions that require moral or ethical judgment from the participant. To analyze qualitative data, I used an affinity diagram to plot the participants' responses under themes identified during the interviews. Using different colored sticky notes for each participant, comments were placed with respect to the issues they addressed as well as their relation to each other. Finally, I conducted an online survey of educators using the website surveymonkey.com. Because I had limited time to complete the survey and analyze the responses, I decided to implement one survey designed for adult respondents rather than making 2 to account for the cognitive differences between kindergartners and their teachers. Surveys are useful for collecting more quantitative data from larger populations because they can be easily distributed over greater geographical areas. My survey was distributed via email to over 200 public school educators in the Western Washington area and received over 60 responses. Just because surveys can be easily distributed doesn't mean that they are always successful. To design an effective survey, I made careful considerations for the questions I would ask, the order I would ask them, and the methods I would use to analyze the responses. I also piloted the survey to ensure that the questions were clear and understandable from others' perspectives. Even after all these research activities, it took a tremendous amount of time and effort to analyze and interpret the results in a way that would be meaningful and actionable for stakeholders and design teams. This is probably the most difficult and most important part of user research. Although I learned a lot about kindergarten classrooms and their use of technology, I learned much more about successfully conducting user research activities. I learned to be flexible to work with participants' schedules and to plan ahead in case something goes wrong. Gaining insight into the perspectives, beliefs, and realities of users is a complicated task. By studying people in the context of their everyday lives and activities, user researchers can help translate complex meanings into practical designs. By conducting user research activities, I learned how research contributes to the development of successful and innovative products. I also gained valuable experience toward becoming a part of a human-centered design team, and I look forward to taking advantage of similar opportunities in the future.